Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome. We're just going to wait a few seconds to allow everybody to get in. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks for your patience whilst everybody joins the conversation. You can see John and Tracy settled there on their sofa. People are still joining. Just hang on for another few seconds to allow everybody to enter. We have a fantastic audience tonight. Brilliant. Okay. So hello, welcome. Good evening, everyone, and a happy National Tree Week. My name is Sarah Lom, and I'm CEO of the Tree Council, which is the charity that brings everybody together for the love of trees. Welcome to our first ever tree-related arts and cultural festival, which tonight we are delighted to welcome best-selling authors Jonathan Drori and Tracy Chevalier. The conversation is going to begin in just a moment, but one item of housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions, do please pop them in the box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll aim to answer as many of them as possible at the end. So we're really excited and very honoured to be invited into Tracy and Jonathan's home to take a virtual seat with them on their sofa. Jonathan was with us for our 30th anniversary event with our volunteer tree wardens earlier this year, when he captivated us with his stories of his travels around the world with 80 trees. That book is a must-have for any tree lover. It's been published in 14 languages. John is a trustee of the Eden Project. He's an ambassador for WWF, and he was previously a documentary filmmaker for the BBC. And he's one of the most fiercely intelligent and witty people that I know. And Tracy Chevalier is equally astonishing. She's the author of 10 novels, including Girl with a Pearl Earring, which has been translated into 43 languages, has sold 5 million copies, and been made into a film. And as I'm sure you know, several of Tracy's books feature trees at the heart of them. At the Edge of the Orchard is one of my special favorites, but there's also Why Willows Weep, which I'm sure we'll be hearing more about in due course. So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Tracy, for your fantastic support. And thank you too to you, our amazing audience, for joining us this evening. And now it's time to settle back comfortably onto your virtual sofa as I hand over to Tracy and Jonathan to lead us on their walk through the trees. Thank you, John and Tracy.
Thank you so much. Do you know what, Sarah? You're probably in the wrong job. You should have been someone's agent with an intro like that. Thank you. Look, our plan is to, we'll talk and read bits and so on for the next 45 minutes or so. And then there'll be time for lots of questions and things, we hope. We won't be able to see the questions as you type them, so you can be as rude as you like, probably.
I might look afterwards.
Yeah, we might look
so
afterwards.
So don't be too rude.
but someone's going to collate those and sort of read them out at the end. So the first thing we thought we'd start with is to sort of think a bit about what inspired us towards trees. And for me, I remember growing up in southwest London and being kind of taken almost against my will, but I didn't really have a will at that age, to Kew Gardens and Richmond Park almost every week. And my parents kind of jollied us along to look at the plants by sort of feeding us bits of them quite often, which was interesting when it came to things like opium poppies and some of the more poisonous and psychedelic plants.
That explains a lot about you, doesn't it?
And our son, it seems to have gone on to him. But I also remember, very vividly, a trip to Petersham, which is in Petersham, part of Richmond Park. And in the introduction to the book, I wrote this, which sort of described my feelings really about this amazing tree. One of my earliest memories is of a spectacular cedar of Lebanon near our home. One winter morning, we found it dead, its trunk and limbs strewn haphazardly and being sawn up. It had been struck by lightning. That was the first time I saw my father cry. I thought about the huge, heavy, beautiful tree that was hundreds of years old and that I had thought invincible and wasn't. And my father, who I had thought would always be in benign control of everything and wasn't. I recall my mother saying that there had been a whole world in that tree, and I remember puzzling over that. But my mother was right, there was a whole world in that tree, and so there is in every tree. And I think that was, you know, I remember that moment so vividly, and obviously it's a sort of emotional moment. And I think for me, that was the time when I suddenly kind of got it with trees. And I think I was probably about 6 or 7 at the time.
Yeah, and I was probably about 5 or 6 when I had my moment with a tree. And I think a lot of people trace their love of trees back to childhood. I think we have a very close, really physically, literally physically close relationship with trees when we're kids, because at least in the old days, we used to climb them a lot. And when I was growing up, as you can hear from my accent, I'm not from these shores. I'm from Washington, D.C. And there was a beech tree in our backyard in our house in Washington, and it was climbable if you were tall enough to reach the lowest branches. And I wasn't quite tall enough, but my older brother and sister were, and I hated standing at the bottom looking up at them, and they got up in the tree. And then finally, I was tall enough and strong enough to pull myself up, and that happened when my father was away on a trip. He was, interesting, we both had memories of our fathers and trees. He was a photographer for the Washington Post, and he was on a long canoeing trip down the Potomac, taking pictures while a journalist was writing stories. And so he'd been away for several weeks. And the day he came back, I managed to climb up the tree, and I was up there with my brother and sister. And then we heard the car in the driveway, and my dad had come back, and my brother and sister raced down the tree and went to meet him and ran to meet him. And I was stuck up the tree because I didn't know how to get down. So yeah, a big lesson, learn how to get down too. You know, it's like cats get up trees and they don't know how to come down. That was me at age 5, but I loved that beech tree. And beech trees are perfect. They're so smooth, they're perfect for climbing. So that was my earliest memory, vivid memory of love of trees.
And often quite difficult to climb because the branches start quite a long way up, you know, once the trees are grown up. But that smoothness has given the beech tree an association with writers and writing for as long as we've got records of beech trees and writers. So Virgil famously complained bitterly that Virgil, the Roman commentator and poet, complained bitterly that people were carving their names into beech trees and, you know, hearts and things and, you know, sort of initials and whatnot. And then did it himself. I mean, what a hypocrite. And the reason that the beech trees are so smooth compared with other trees is that the bark flakes off in this sort of almost like a sort of powdery way and regenerates itself all the time. So it's got quite a different kind of bark structure from other trees, which makes it a sort of wonderful tabula rasa, a sort of blank page for writing on. And a lot of the languages in Europe have the same kind of word for book as they do for beech. So book and beech in English, you can see there's a similarity, but in German, Bücher and Buch are very, very similar. And you know, the beech was used to make the boards that the papers and things were sort of you know, compressed with. And people would also put, you know, would carve lettering onto beech wood. And in fact, in German, even today, the word for alphabet, the letters of the alphabet are Buchstaben, you know, stabs on beech wood, which I think is a sort of rather wonderful link to writing. And in a moment, Tracy will be reading a fable about another tree. But you know, there's a link between beeches and fables. And again, in sort of Middle Europe, there's this idea that lightning never strikes a beech tree. And it's a saying in German and other Middle European languages. And actually, if you look at the data, if you're nerdy enough to do that, then you'll see that beech trees are struck by lightning just as much as all the other trees around.
No, say it isn't so.
But what is so is that when beech trees are struck by lightning, they survive. and the other trees don't. And the reason is because of this smooth bark. If you imagine a lightning storm, it's going to be wet, it's going to be raining, and the water forms a film around the bark, which is continuous, unlike a craggy old oak where the water would be, the damp patches would be broken up by dry bits in the crags. And that means that the electricity can flow, if it's struck by lightning, down the edge of the tree, down the outside and into the ground without actually going through the inside and exploding it.
See, I live with all this knowledge.
In a good way.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely, dear.
I think that's a perfect segue.
Yeah.
While we do the sort of main readings, where there are only a couple, each of us is going to sort of step out so we can, not detract.
Yeah,
so I'm going to leave the shot for a second.
He's leaving me, okay. Really what we're doing tonight is talking about how we've approached trees, both non-fictionally and fictionally. And we're going to start with actually John reading. Yes. John, instead of the beach, we are going to talk about the birch tree.
Okay, so you can see how
written about it. Yes.
You can see how brilliantly rehearsed this was, and the script and everything. Oh, right. Okay,
but
so
I am very gracefully going to step out and let John talk about the birch tree. Over to you.
Oh God, how socially awkward do I feel? But there you go. I can't see anyone else at the moment, so so this is probably all right. That's best really. They're all laughing at me. So this is an example of how a piece of non-fiction about the birch. With cascades of delicate, pendulous branches that sway in any breeze, the silver birch is as graceful as a ballet dancer. Its fluttering leaves are pale green diamonds, serrated and borne on slender twigs, warty from their resin glands. Its implausible paleness is an adaptation, helping trees that lack the shade of dense foliage to keep cool trunks in the day and night sunshine of a northern summer, or in the glare of snow. The bark of young birches is invitingly smooth. Another short extract. In 1988, the Finnish people, ever enthusiasts for democracy, voted the silver birch their national tree. Their choice had little to do with its commercial use for pulp and ply, nor its excellence as firewood, but was an expression of emotion. By day, the distinctive monochrome pattern of snow-clad birch forests is dazzling and disorientating, but during long boreal nights, their moonlit, ghostly forms take on an eerie power. Birches abound in the folk tales of northern peoples, and many superstitions and rituals surround the tree. And then a bit later on in the birch entry, I go on to describe one of those superstitions, and I guess there aren't too many kids watching, so let's go for this. Trees often develop symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi, which intermingle with their roots and extend beyond them in a huge web of minutely thin filaments. These networks are especially good at extracting nutrients from the soil, which they pass on in an easily digestible form. In return, the fungus receives sugars from the tree. Individual tree species cooperate with particular fungi. The birch's life partner is Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, whose fruiting bodies, the parts we see above ground, are scarlet with white sprinkles, the archetypal toadstools of every fairy tale. Fly agarics contain a cocktail of mind-bending hallucinogens around which all manner of shamanistic rituals have evolved, particularly among Siberian tribes and the Sami people of northern Finland and Sweden. So far, so human. Many cultures have psychedelic traditions. However, the fly agaric's psychoactive ingredients are not completely broken down in the body, but excreted. This offers the enticing possibility of intoxication and a spot of social bonding, no doubt, by drinking the pre-drugged urine of others. Now, it's true that northern nights are especially long, and the forests might have been lacking in other excitement. However, one can't help wondering whether this practice was really as widespread as the few historic travelers who seem to be the common source of all the shamanistic pee-drinking stories were told and so eagerly reported. Come back to the sofa, Trace.
I'm coming back.
So that's
such a great story. story.
That's
And it's, well, is it true?
well, it's a sort of gift to any writer, isn't it? And the reason I had to put it in that way is because, you know, when I researched it and went back through, you know, it sort of received wisdom. But when you research it and go back to from source to source, it was just this like couple of travelers in Russia in the early sort of late 18th century who were probably told this by the locals. Oh yeah, we always drink that. We always drink each other's urine. They believed it, except obviously with a Russian accent.
Great. Yes.
Anyway, from Beech's, from Birch's non-fiction to Birch's in fiction, and I'm going to leave the sofa now.
Off you go. He's leaving the sofa. He's going to sit, when we're reading, we sit out of sight on the floor. Off he goes. Off he goes. So I first got involved with writing about trees because the charity Woodland Trust, who look after our UK native trees and help replant, asked me, John was on the board, and they asked me through him, if I would help with, including getting writers to do something about trees and bring some attention to UK trees and to the Woodland Trust. And I came up with this idea to do an anthology called Why Willows Weep. And I asked various writers to write a very, very short fables, choosing one of the 23, I think, or so UK native trees and writing a 2 or 3 page fable about them. So there are all kinds of people have written, Amanda Craig, William Fiennes, Philippa Gregory, Joanne Harris, Philip Hensher, Richard Mabey, Maggie O'Farrell, loads of people. And I'm going to read from that. I wrote one too about the birch, the silver birch. So I thought it would be a good compare and contrast with the way a nonfiction writer writes about trees and the way a fiction writer might take a tree and write about it. So this is Why Birches Have Silver Bark. Birch trees did not always have silver bark. There was a time when their trunks were the gray-brown of most other trees. It was sex that changed things. It always does. Long ago, a girl grew up in a village surrounded by thick forests full of all sorts of trees: elm, ash, beech, birch, rowan, hornbeam. She loved trees and knew the forest well. Unfortunately, the girl's parents were very strict and would not allow her to have a boyfriend. The men in the village were not good enough for her, they felt. The girl was less picky and more hormonal. One day, she arranged to meet a man. "Come to the ash grove north of the village at midnight," she whispered to him as they drew water from the village well. He nodded, too ashamed to admit he had no idea what an ash tree looked like. Instead, he crashed about in the woods for an hour before giving up and going home. He's too interested in football to care about me, the girl thought, and set her sights on another. "Meet me at the stand of beech trees east of the village," she instructed as they were buying bread at the baker's. This man also knew more about sports than trees and didn't even get beyond the willows at the edge of the village before he turned back. The girl decided to make it as easy as possible for her next potential lover. "Do you know the old oak that stands on its own in the middle of the woods to the south of the village?" she said as they waited for their flour to be ground at the village mill. "Meet me there." Surely everyone knows what an oak looks like. But no, the man stood under a lone elm, wondering if its wood would make a good cricket bat. The girl waited under the oak tree and wept at the thought of dying a virgin. "My parents are right," she sobbed. "The village men are too stupid for me." She gave up on men then, until one day a stranger arrived. Not only was he handsome, but he also didn't care much for sports, turning down the chance to play five-a-side football or cricket on the village green. Instead, he wove the girl a daisy chain. She took this as a good sign and invited him to meet her, though she decided to test him on his tree knowledge. Only a tree-loving man would do. "Meet me in the birch wood, to the west of the village," she commanded. The man agreed. Unfortunately, however, he was from the city, where even fewer people knew about trees. And being a man, he wouldn't admit he couldn't tell a birch from a beech. He simply trusted fate. If they were meant to be together, he would find her. Now, the birch trees had already had some other suitors stumble through them on their abortive rendezvous, so when the girl came to wait among them, they knew what might happen. Indeed, as it grew late and the man did not arrive, the girl began to weep. Then the moon appeared from behind a cloud, lighting up the forest. Among the birches, there was one tree with mutant genes that made its bark a silvery white. The other birches had often teased it for being different, but on this night, its difference became its strength. For when the moonlight struck it, it lit up like a beacon in the dark forest. Seeing its glow, the man made straight for it, and there found the girl. She was so relieved to have a lover at last that in her post-coital bliss, she vowed to protect the silver birch from ever being chopped down. This protected status ensured not only its long life, but its propagation as well. After a time, silver birches became the norm. They are still the best trees for a tryst.
God, I'm glad that's fantastic, by the way, obviously. But I'm so glad that I can tell a beech from a birch, and now I know.
That's the test, John.
Yeah,
that was the test.
I can imagine your parents saying, "Oh, for God's sake, ask him. Can he tell the beech from a birch?" Yeah. It's obviously being a bloke, I'd like to think that your interest in trees or in writing about trees was inspired by me. Probably wasn't.
It kind of was. Of course it was.
But you do have a sort of real taste for trees, don't you?
I got a taste from creating that, helping to create Why Willows Weep. And after a while, after I'd written a short story about it, I thought, actually, I think I want to write something more meatier, longer. And I'm a historical novelist, and I had written a novel called The Last Runaway, which is set in mid-19th century Ohio. And when I was doing research for that book, I read a book by Michael Pollan called The Botany of Desire. There's a chapter in it about apples and how apple trees were kind of distributed and grown throughout Ohio and Indiana in the mid-19th century by a kind of folkloric hero who really existed named Johnny Appleseed. And I read this chapter not because of apples, but because it was set at the same time as the book I was writing. And I thought I can glean some details of everyday life from this. But the chapter really stuck with me. I had learned about Johnny Appleseed as a kid, and he was presented as a hero, as somebody who distributed healthy apples, apple eating in Ohio, and actually Michael Pollan wrote the reality was very different. He grew Johnny Appleseed sold seeds and grew saplings, trees from seed. And when you do that with an apple tree, if you want. You never know if you're going to get a spitter or an eater. So a sour apple or a sweet apple. If you want a sweet apple, which most people did, so it seemed, you have to graft the tree. So it's almost like cloning from a tree that you already know. So most of the apples that we eat their origins are from one tree and not from the seeds, but from grafting. So, but Johnny Appleseed sold trees that were not grafted. They were grown from seed, and they mostly produced what were called spitters. And actually, those were meant to be used for making cider. And Johnny Appleseed was actually not a promoter of healthy eating. He was more a promoter of unhealthy drinking, because it was a tough life in Ohio in the mid-19th century. And a lot of people drank hard cider to get through the days and the nights.
Was it promoted at the time as being sort of a healthy thing, but all the kind of the cider drinkers knew it wasn't really, or has it become a myth since?
I don't think they had an opinion about cider being good or bad for you, or alcohol being good or bad for you. I mean, people in the UK and in Europe for centuries, the water was bad for drinking, so people drank what was called small beer. So it was a bit like that. So they made cider and they made applejack, and I was fascinated by the fact that this was such a different way of looking at Johnny Appleseed and at Ohio and at apple trees. And I thought, I want to write, after The Last Runaway, I want to write a novel about that, about trees. And I'm going to write about apple trees and Johnny Appleseed. And one of the things I learned from the research was that when settlers were coming from the East Coast of the States and moving to Ohio, when they wanted to settle on land that at that time only Native Americans were there, were being pushed out, if they wanted to stake a claim, they had to plant an orchard of 50 fruit trees within 3 years of arrival, because it was like putting down a marker saying, yes, we're going to stay here for a while. Because first of all, the trees would not produce fruit right away. So that meant they were going to have to stay for a while. But also you look after an orchard really becomes yours. And that was, I really focused on that.
Yeah, it's very easy when we eat fruit, I think, to sort of think that somehow we look at it through a human lens and think, what a wonderful thing that we've got here, the fruit. But of course, from the tree's point of view, humans aren't really sort of part of it. They've evolved to have fruit so that the seeds which are inside the fruit will be distributed by animals that will come along and eat those fruit because they're deliciously fruity and sweet and all the rest of it, and will poo out those seeds,
or spit them out
far enough away that they will be planted away from the mother tree, so they're not competing, and also generally with a little dollop of fertilizer, so the spit doesn't really do it. A little dollop of fertilizer, and this is of course why fruit are laxative, right? Because the last thing you want is your fruit to remain, your seeds to remain in a hostile environment of the intestines for too long. So rush it through, get it out there, little dollop of fertilizer, bish bash bosh.
If you don't remember anything from this evening, remember that seeds with the poo, that's what does it.
Of course, plants have, trees have hit on evolved lots of ways to get things to, because they're rooted to the spot, literally. They've commandeered all sorts of things to pollinate their flowers, to distribute their seeds. So some seeds kind of stick to animals' coats, some of them get eaten, some of them, float away. Some of them, plummet and just sort of sit there, but then put out a sort of sapling 12 meters away or whatever. There are lots of ways that one of the sort of clever ones is actually oak trees with acorns. They rest on the fact that the acorns are much desired by squirrels, and squirrels are fabulously forgetful, so they bury a whole load of future trees. They plant these acorns for the tree and then forget where they put them. So the tree has got a load of acorns growing. Fantastic.
So John's book is full of stuff like that,
but in an emotional and tender kind of a way. Many trees have been moved by humans, though, over large distances. So apples originated somewhere around Kazakhstan, probably, and people brought apples on journeys and chucked the seeds away, spat the seeds away, and horses trampled them in, and they grew, and then they evolved and speciated along the way.
It's on the Silk Road, I think.
Yeah. And then. But lots and lots of trees have been taken by humans from one place to another. So a really interesting example, I think, is the cinchona tree, which has given us quinine. And for good or ill, without the bark of that tree, Europeans wouldn't have been able to colonize the tropics. So the product of a tree, not a seed or a fruit in this case, the bark, fabulously changed the course of history. You've got things like rubber. So rubber comes from the latex of a rubber tree, which is native to South America, to the American Amazon, and that latex is there for the tree's purpose, to defend itself. So if something scrapes against the tree or it's wounded, or if an insect tries to burrow in, it'll get engulfed in this latex, which forms a layer that can protect it. But in one of the first instances of biopiracy on an epic scale, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, I later spent 9 years on the board there, so I shouldn't be dissing them, but they sent out pirates essentially to go and collect up seeds from rubber trees, and then they worked out how to germinate them and took them to the British colonies in Malaysia, and developed basically a monopoly of the rubber trade.
Built. Sorry, when was this?
This would have been the 18th century,
right.
And it was an absolutely sort of huge deal. This late 18th, early 19th century, big thing going on in rubber. And Henry Ford, the car manufacturer in the United States, got absolutely incensed. I mean, he was a very strange guy in a lot of ways, but he got completely incensed, perhaps understandably, by the British having commandeered rubber and had a monopoly of it. And he decided to grow it in the sort of plantations in the Amazon, but he didn't employ botanists. And he had some funny rules about people in the town that he built, which is still there, festering in the Amazon, called Fordlandia. He wouldn't allow any women on site, and he wouldn't allow the men to play football. So that obviously collapsed and didn't work, and the British retained their monopoly. And then there was Gutta-Percha, which is another latex plant, which in a way sort of had more of an effect on the world than rubber. And yet hardly anyone knows it, because nowadays the only purpose of Gutta-Percha latex, which comes from Malaysia, is for making dental implants. But it used to be that it had just the right properties for making golf balls with. So golf became a sort of sport. But that isn't the thing that changed the world. The thing that changed the world, and this isn't probably something you were expecting to hear as a sentence, is that Gutta-Percha latex makes the best insulation for submarine cables. Wow, I hear you say, why is that important? And the reason is that if you can have insulated submarine cables, you can have nations speaking to nations over the telephone. And after a few decades at this sort of in the late 1800s and then the beginning of the 19th century, there were 250,000 miles of submarine cables carrying telephone calls. And those telephone calls were only enabled by the Gutta-Percha tree. Another fantastic example of
sorry, but somebody is a friend of ours, Carol Boyle, who's a dentist, is watching, and she just said that Gutta-Percha is used not for implants but for fillings. We stand corrected. John stands corrected.
Yeah, the royal we stands corrected. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carol.
Do you know what? This is the problem of being
getting
on the same
heckled by friends.
Heckled by your wife. This is like, there's no way you could. Have you finished?
I'm finished.
Okay, thanks.
Let's carry on.
Dental implant, dental. What was it?
Dental fillings, not implants.
Okay. So, Carol, perhaps you could just put a comment on here, Carol. I'm concerned because the fillings that I've got in my teeth, too many of them, are really tough. Materials that are sort of like ceramic-y kind of metal-y things. And Gutta-Percha isn't that tough. So, is it used for making a mold or what? Anyway, you'll tell us. I'm just putting my hand on Tracy because you'll go over to the machine.
Right. We'll get the
the final one that I wanted to, before I finally hand over to you, according to the script, is there are trees like the monkey puzzle, which come from the snowy slopes of Chile and grew up to fend off dinosaurs or very, very big, scary animals that don't exist anymore, which is why they're so armored. But at one time were, the source of another kind of piracy of people trying to steal the seeds. Normally they were eaten and roasted, but the sailors at the time said we'd like some unroasted so they could take them back and plant them. And then William Lobb, who was the great plant prospector of the day, he brought them back and made a sort of business out of it.
Yes, and in fact, William Lobb is a character in At the Edge of the Orchard, the book I wrote about apple trees and redwoods and sequoias.
I'm going to interrupt you. Carol Boyle says it's used inside root canals, internal to the tooth, not fillings inside the mouth. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
There's always more knowledge out there than on our sofa.
Yes, it's so
Back
true.
to you, Tracy.
Thank you. John, do you remember about 30 years ago, we went to Mid Wales for a little holiday, and we stayed in a bed and breakfast where we had to pretend we were married. We weren't, but we pretended we were married because we thought that was what they wanted. And
It's
they
Wales.
said they were lovely. Shush. They were really lovely. And they said, you're near Offa's Dyke, which is this wonderful path that goes up along it zigzags in and out of the border. And there's a grove of redwood trees just off the path. Go and have a look. And we did, and they were really gorgeous. And they had been planted in 1857. And when I was, many years later, when I was writing at the edge of the orchard, I wanted to follow this idea of trees being brought places by people, trees almost being immigrants as the way people are. They get moved around, although of course once one's planted, as John said, it doesn't move, so it's got to send its seed out. But trees themselves and seeds of trees got moved around. And so apple trees got planted, moved around by people, and so did redwoods and sequoias. They are native to coastal parts of, redwoods, coastal parts of California. Sequoias just in a few groves a little bit further inland. And there was this Victorian craze in the UK in the mid-19th century for exotic trees and plants. So loads of stuff we plant in our English country gardens are from elsewhere, like nasturtiums are from South America, and monkey puzzles. As John said, William Lobb was this prospector, brought back, he worked for a nursery, brought back loads and loads of both seeds and saplings of all kinds of different trees, including redwoods and sequoias. And I ended up writing about him. He's not the main character, but my main character is a man named Robert Goodenough, who grows up among those apple trees in Ohio. And when he crosses the states, he's going west to escape his crazy family. And he ends up, John's going to leave for a little bit while I read. He ends up in California, wandering around. He meets William Lobb, but before he meets him, he hears about these huge trees that have just been discovered that are called sequoias. And they have, the base of their trunk is like the size of a house. And they are 150 feet high, or 200 feet high. They're huge. And he decides he wants to go and see these. So he comes to the forest, to this grove called Calaveras Grove. And I just want to read, I had to go and see these trees for myself. And one of the things I noticed is they're so high, they're so big, and way huger than we are, that people, when they come up to them, look up and they always steady themselves with their hand on the tree. And that's the kind of little piece of information, a little color that I would never have thought of myself. That's why I have to go to places to see that. So I went and I watched people doing that, and I felt what it felt like underneath. I felt what the turf underneath the trees and the bark, and I poured that all into these two paragraphs I'm going to read to you. When Robert arrived at the edge of the grove, he dismounted and stood, hand on his horse's neck, anchoring him. In his travels, he had seen many things that had given him an ache deep in his chest, like a splinter of sadness needling into his heart, prairie that swept far out of sight, a single elm tree that made the sky behind it seem like the bluest he'd ever witnessed, a tornado cycling across the gray-green horizon. Now he was seeing another. Two enormous trees stood on either side of the track, a natural entrance to the wood beyond. They were not as tall as redwoods Robert had seen on the coast, but they were much wider, as wide at their bases as a cabin. They dwarfed a person with their girth and the volume of wood they thrust towards the sky. If you stood far enough back to take in the whole of the trees, you didn't feel how enormous they were. If you came up close, though, you couldn't see their lowest branches. Robert walked up the path, feeling as he did that he was shrinking into a speck beside the two trees. He put a hand on one to steady himself. The tawny red surface was spongy and thickly fissured, a fibrous bark that shed easily and turned into red dust Robert later found in his clothes and his hair, under his fingernails, in his saddlebags. The forest floor around the trees was thick and springy, with thousands of years of rotting needles muffling his steps. And it was quiet, for there were no branches anywhere near him to rustle in the wind. Branches only started to grow from about 100 feet up, and the bulk of them were so high over his head that it strained his neck to look at them for long. Robert had no words for the odd, hollowed out feeling that swelled inside him. Now, somebody just complimented the apple cushion. Yes, we like to theme our cushions with what we talk about.
So, when you look at redwood trees, the coastal redwoods, they are just so ridiculously big. It's a kind of, and I won't. We haven't got time for me to sort of describe how I describe them as well. But they, from a sort of science point of view, one of the most amazing things about redwoods is that they manage to pump water all the way up to the top. If you ask any engineer about, sort of water pumping, I'm sure you do, getting water to the top of something that is, 120 meters high is really, really takes a lot of effort and power. And, there's a whole lot of kind of scientific debate actually still about exactly how they do that, which we won't go into here. But one of the interesting things, or, something that sort of makes me gasp actually, is that anywhere in the universe where there are trees that have water in the way that we've got, and the same amount of gravity that we've got, the tallest trees that there can ever be will be as tall as the coastal redwoods. And if you look at the fossil record on this planet, and you look at the very tallest examples of other very tall trees, like the mountain ashes and some of the eucalyptuses and so on, and you look at the very, very tallest examples of those that have ever existed, then they are only as tall as the tallest coastal redwoods, 120 meters. And the reason is to do with how long a column of water can be supported, which is based on the sort of qualities of water and the sort of the way the molecules cohere to each other. And anywhere in the universe, no bigger than 120 meters. I was just going to say that because we've only got a couple of minutes, that one of the things that it's very difficult not to do with trees is anthropomorphize. Yeah. That we, one of the most, I ended up with this sort of surprise bestseller about trees, and I gave lots of talks, and the question that came up in a lot of, I bet there are some.
Yeah, I was going to say
here,
there's probably a question here about it.
Is, are trees sentient? And there is a real desire on the part of many people to feel that trees are sentient. And, in a way, it would be good if they were, because we might protect them more. I don't think they're sentient in the way that we think of brains and thought as being sentient, but there is information that is transmitted between trees. Whether it's intentional or not is a whole other matter, and I would say it's not intentional. But they not only send the products of photosynthesis through those fungal networks that I mentioned earlier on when I was talking about birch, but they also have chemical signals that trigger other chemicals in other trees, so the trees can defend themselves from attack and so on. And there's a sort of almost what feels to us, though we project onto it, a kind of altruistic behavior. And there is a community of trees, and they interdepend on each other, and the species, and across different species as well. But whether that's sentience or not, I don't know.
I found when I was writing at the edge of the orchard, I wanted the trees to be characters in a way, but not human characters. I didn't want to give them human characteristics or human emotions. I focused more on the humans' emotions towards the trees rather than any sort of reciprocal feeling. But it was, and one of the ways of doing that was to really focus strongly on the things that I could say about the trees. So that passage I just read about the sequoias is very much a descriptive about where the branches start and what it feels like thousands of years of needles compacting, and what that bark, it creates this dust that you find everywhere. Those really specific qualities are what I felt brought the trees to life in a way that was not human, but was very much, gave you a sense of them.
But though your writing is about relationships with trees, clearly from the fable, when the tree has intentionality,
yes,
that works because I think human beings have this sort of feeling in us that trees, they're not human, they're something else, but in the way that Tolkien and his Ents and lots of examples from literature and fables of trees somehow being sentient. And I think that it's a sort of open door you're pushing on.
So John, if you let's reverse it, not anthropomorphize the trees, but let's arborealize you. If you were going to be a tree, what tree would it be?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, Tracy. Not rehearsed at all, but a 9-year-old once asked me that at the end of the talk, and I thought, what a great question. And the tree I would like to be, you'll have to imagine it. If you know what a sort of aloe vera plant looks like, it's a great big version of the aloe vera that grows in the Namibian desert called the Quiver Tree, Aloidendron dichotoma, I think it's called, or something like that. And it's about sort of 40, 50 feet high, thrives where nothing else thrives in the Namib desert. It's absolutely extraordinary thing. And it isn't that resilience that makes me want to be that tree, though that's nice. But two reasons. One is that it's the national tree of Namibia, and therefore anyone who sees it in Namibia will be smiling. And it's like Tracy's got a Morris Minor. When we go in it, everyone smiles at us. I think they're smiling at us, maybe laughing at us. But anyway, it's like that. So I'd like to be a tree that everyone's smiling at. And secondly, it has a white powdery coating on it that just makes you want to touch it. The white powdery coating is there to reflect some of the very intense ultraviolet light of the Namib desert. But it's also something, because people want to sort of touch it, I think the idea of being something, a tree that people smile at and want to stroke, that I'd like to be a quiver tree. And it's called a quiver tree, by the way, because the local people use the branches hollowed out to keep quivers in, to keep arrows in.
Okay.
And you?
I would be a copper beech. I loved beech trees, as you heard at the beginning. When I was growing up, I had this love for this particular beech tree. And then I moved to the UK for over 30 years ago, and I don't think I'd ever noticed copper beeches in the States. Maybe they do have them, I'm sure they do, but here they're really noticeable, particularly in the countryside. And I love the fact that they are the same tree that I know, and yet they've transformed. The color of the leaves are transformed to this shimmering copper. And I like to think of myself as transforming, having come from the US to the UK. So it's just a gorgeous tree, and that's why.
Oh, lovely. But just while Sarah is plugging herself back in to be able to field the questions, you might wonder why copper beeches are able to sort of photosynthesize when trees are normally green and plants are green. And
why do they?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. So the reason is that there is all the chlorophyll and everything else in the leaf, but it's got these other dyes on top of it that make it look purple to us, but actually the chlorophyll's still doing its thing. Sarah.
I have to say, this has been, I know that you can see in the chat as well, this has been the most incredible session. It is the most incredible session. You've really moved me with the readings, and you have made me laugh out loud. I was just sitting here laughing, which is wonderful.
They're laughing at us.
They are laughing at us.
No, laughing with you. So you have actually answered some of the questions, but there's one here for you, Tracy. Have you ever had an idea for a novel that originated from a conversation that you had with Jonathan? Or does Jonathan help feed your creative process at times?
Careful.
That's a really interesting question. I would say no, he hasn't given me an idea for a novel, but I think At the Edge of the Orchard, I don't think it would have happened if I hadn't lived with him, because we'd go for walks and he talks about trees a lot, and I learned a lot of this stuff because it's such a it just seeps in after a while, and I think I wouldn't have necessarily, although John didn't say, I think you should write a book about trees, about apple trees and redwoods. The love of trees is there, and that really brought it out. I
suppose why Willows Weep came from one of our interminable car journeys down to Dorset, and we were sort of thinking, what could we do for the Woodland Trust that would? I mean, one of the difficult things for all tree charities, and your own as well, is that how do you create an emotional link between people who don't already love trees and trees? Because it's emotion that unlocks people's wallets, makes them want to protect trees, all of that good stuff. It's hearts and minds. And that's why we were sort of thinking, how do we do that? And, hey, we've got a writer in the car, maybe we could do something with that, so that sort of thing came out.
Speaking of that, Sarah, I believe the Tree Council is going to plant orchards around the country. Is that right? Because I was talking about orchards earlier, about in Ohio, you had to plant an orchard and it sort of established you as a settler. And I think that people really have an emotional connection with fruit trees in particular, because they're bountiful. And there's a harvest that goes on and in the autumn. And I think that's a really cool idea. Do you want to just tell us briefly about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really all happening now. We had an amazing campaign called Be a Tree Angel with the Daily Mail last Christmas. And just now this season, we're planting with 720 schools across the UK, from the Scilly Isles right up to Fort William, 30,000 orchards, fruit trees, and fruiting hedgerows, because the hedgerows we love equally just as much. And that means there'll be something like 250,000 young people who will be involved out there planting their orchards, watching them grow. It's all about, it's the healthy eating aspects. It makes people feel better. I think kids have really suffered through the pandemic, not only from the climate anxiety that they had before, but from the anxiety about the pandemic that we've been through. And getting outdoors and planting can make all the difference and really transform their lives. So thank you. If there's anybody who's with us today who supported that campaign, we're incredibly grateful, as are all the young people who are taking part. It's absolutely brilliant.
Go and donate, folks. Or wait 10 minutes till we finish, and then go and donate.
And some of you who have kids, in a few years, they're probably going to be bringing home apples from these very orchards. So something well worth supporting. Now, are there any other questions you have for us?
Well, there's one actually that's come up, which is, hi, Tracy and John, really enjoying some good tree chat. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on reforesting the UK, and what trees would you be planting in a world where there's climate change and migration of species? And then there's a little funny one after, which I think you might both laugh at, from the same person, from Glyn Goodwin. Also, have you now thought of writing together the historical science novel, The Girl with the Latex Root Canals?
Yes, actually, we'd already copyrighted that idea, so I'm sorry that you...
I think this is a Glenn I know. Glenn, naughty.
I hate to think it's just our mates on here. Anyway, we are all mates now. Everyone's a mate. Look, the question about epic scale tree planting is a really good one, because bound up in that question, there are lots of different reasons for planting trees. They reduce flooding, they give us fruit, they clean our air, they do all sorts of things. But two of the key, most important things they do are, number one, they give us more biodiversity. So biodiversity is a good thing, right? And I could bore for England on biodiversity, but I won't right now. But basically, if you imagine a sort of game of Jenga, where you're sort of pulling out bits until the whole lot collapses all of a sudden. That's what we're doing with ecosystems at the moment. We're taking out species, they're going extinct, they're having a really hard time, and the whole thing might look okay, but really it isn't. We depend on all those little critters and things that live in oak trees, that feed the birds, that take the insects off our crops in a good way. And I mean, we're part of an ecosystem. Biodiversity is hugely important, and tree planting helps with that. And the second reason is that we're facing a global crisis with climate, and the crisis is caused by too much carbon dioxide in the air, which we're sort of putting in there by burning fossil fuels, right? And the reason that trees are great is that, in common with all other plants, what they do for a living, what photosynthesis actually is that they take carbon dioxide out of the air, and they have this wonderful sort of magic chemical reaction with water that comes up from the roots, and they make heavy stuff that you can kick. So a tree doesn't get its stuff out of the ground, right, which is what people think, because, and if they did, then we'd be forever filling in the holes that the trees have taken the stuff out of, right? But we don't see lorries doing that at night. The trees are made of carbon dioxide from the air. That's the solid stuff, right? And so the more trees we can plant, the more carbon dioxide is stored. And that's why the sort of facile arguments of HS2 and people who want to sort of bulldoze large trees, don't stand up, because you can imagine that a few whips or saplings that you put in to replace a 200-year-old tree, a 200-year-old tree is much, much heavier. It's got much more carbon in it than a few piddling little trees, and it's got much more biodiversity. So the second part of the question is, what should you plant? And the answers are native trees, right? Native trees, because they live in a sort of dynamic equilibrium with all the little critters that live here as well, right? So that's a good thing. And it's not a sort of sterile environment that you get if you sort of import something, and it won't be invasive in the way that something might be if it's got nothing to compete with it, if you bring it in from abroad. Last part of the question was, where should you get those trees from? We need to do it in a safe way, which means probably breeding them in this country. But the genetic source may be from a little bit further afield, and we might go a bit further south for some of the oaks, some of the chestnuts, some of the things that we might just sort of put in the mix.
Great, fantastic. You said that you would welcome some nice wacky questions. So we have a lovely wacky question for you.
Nice wacky questions.
John, can you tell us what you think Tracy would be if she weren't a novelist? And Tracy, can you tell us what John would do if he weren't a tree man?
I haven't been a tree man forever, so that's easy for you.
No, but if you were going to do something completely different from what you have done in the different parts of your life, I would say you would have been a doctor. My husband, the doctor, definitely.
Bedside manner.
Yeah.
Our cat, who is fine now, had this sort of fit earlier on and convulsions and things. It was a bit scary for a bit, but anyway, apparently cats do this. But yeah, who had the bedside manner?
Yeah, I was not very good at dealing with that, but he was very good.
I was telling the cat jokes. Yeah.
So what would I be?
What would you be? I think that you might be. That's such a good question. And I have to be really careful how I answer it, because it's got to be something kind of good. Check out at Tesco. No, I think that one of the things that you do is that you inspire people, and that you really care about people. So I'm wondering about someone who would be a really terrific teacher, or because you often talk about the teachers who've inspired you,
right? And
so I sort of sometimes wonder about that. I don't know. I'll probably think of something completely different.
Well, I'll tell you what I've always thought I would have been if I'd gone down a completely different route was I would have been a designer of environmentally friendly packaging. And weirdly enough, I've been thinking about that for 30 years. And now it's come into its own. So those designers of environmentally friendly packaging are, they are gods right now, gods and goddesses. And I could have been one of them. I could have been a contender, but I went down the novel route instead.
That's amazing. Sadly, we are coming to the end of the evening with Dr. Drori and Professor Chevalier. You've both been absolutely incredible, and so kind of you to invite us into your home. We've heard about sequoias, we've heard about fabulous fables to do with romantic birch trees. And we've been all around the world. We've learned a huge amount, and I think your joy in trees and with each other has really warmed our hearts, which is absolutely amazing. I know, John, that you have a new book which is being published early next year. Is that right?
Yeah, it's creatively, because this one was around the world in 80 trees. If you just sort of scrub out trees and put plants, about a quarter of them will be trees, in fact. But yeah, around the world in 80 plants, published in April or so. With
the same fantastic illustrator,
yeah,
Lucille Leclerc.
Lucille Leclerc is amazing, and I don't know. It's quite hard to, you can see the lovely sort of palette that she's used. And actually, sorry, this is turning into a bit of a plug for,
That's allowed.
Okay. She's French and gloriously French to work with. I've learned so much from her
about French.
No, I mean. Just how she approaches illustration and so on, and in French the word is insolite, which is literally unsolid, but there's a kind of whimsy to her botanically very correct drawings, and there's a sort of wonder to it. And anyway, she's illustrated the second book as well.
So what I'm going to suggest to the people who are here is that actually. Around the World in 80 Trees or Tracy's latest book, Common Thread, would make fantastic stocking fillers, either for your own stocking.
Single thread.
Single thread. Do go out and treat yourself and treat your loved ones. They're absolutely amazing books, and we will be in touch about Jonathan's when it comes out with more details to those who are attending. So I wanted to say a huge thank you again. You've been very, very entertaining, and we've greatly enjoyed it. Talking of books, we have also a new Instagram account, and we've got you a competition on it where you can win a stack of books. And I'm very delighted to say that that Drori Chevalier books will be amongst those. So do take a look at Instagram. It's at the Tree Council. Do go and join it. Thank you again. Can't thank you enough. You've been the most enormous fun, and thank you to our audience as well. We'll see you again soon. What more can I say? Big clap.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. It's really great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Can we close?